Green, Green Grass of Home by Baek Minsuk. Mr. underwent his interview sitting in a lawn chair on the grass. He was photosynthesizing under the scorching sun of 2:30 in the afternoon. That's how eschatology in our country ran out, he explained. It went broke a bit early compared to others elsewhere. That happened already in 1992. In more stable countries, eschatology appears later. Mr. was, as his tone shows, a humble person. He sipped carrot parsley juice from a cup through a straw and continued. In America, eschatology wielded its last power in 1993. You might recall the gun battle between the religious fanatics of the Branch Davidians and agents from both the FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I nodded. I remember that. I was working in a publishing company back then. My monthly salary was about $450, and I edited books till 8 in the evening. A job full of things to complain about. In fact, I was the only ordinary employee and had 3 bosses. One time, when I proofread the word 보잘것없는, trivial, without any spaces or hyphens, Boss A told me to correct it to 보잘-것-없는, and Boss B told me to correct it to 보잘것-없는. When I corrected it one way, then the other, as ordered, Boss C told me to correct it to 보잘것없는, exactly as at first. I envied the eschatological sect leader, I finally added. Oh. Mr. set his cup down and clasped his hands. That's why you quit your job, right? A frown wrinkle appeared between his eyebrows, indicating sympathy. Anyway, he said, the leader of the fanatic group was David Koresh. He was just over 30. As he lay dying after being shot, he made a long-distance call to his mother. Mom, he told her, I'll be resurrected. That's the sort of fellow he was. He was also an unlimited wives for a man ideologue, as he had wives of various ages, ranging from a 12-year-old girl to an old woman of 72. Mr. was a hospitable person. He brought a cup of cola from his kitchen. Cola is just for guests, he explained. I can't require guests to drink carrot or parsley, or onion mixed juice, though cola will harm their health. He said this in a sad tone, as if he could do nothing about it. Well, taste depends on the individual, I murmured, as if making excuses. I put my cup of onion juice down on the chair's armrest and accepted the cola. Anyway, Koresh was once an aspiring rock and roll singer. But after failures in various ways, he had to be satisfied with reciting Bible verses. He would repeatedly warn his followers, the aliens will attack us. Armageddon will take place here in Waco, Texas. Eventually, the aliens showed up in the guise of FBI snipers. Koresh responded to that Armageddon with M16 automatic rifles instead of laser guns. Do you still recall the situation? Mr. asked. He must have felt miserable, I said, nodding, but also excited. When I declared one day that I was quitting my job, I was repeatedly called in to face my bosses. Boss A criticized me personally, saying that I would be unable to work in any publishing company if I felt so heartsick over such a trivial thing as spacing and hyphenating the word 보잘것없는, while Boss B expressed his understanding of my situation working as the only employee under 3 bosses and was going to speak favorably of me to the company president so that my resignation would be turned down. Boss C, helping me pack my stuff, made invidious remarks about what would become of the company with its only employee leaving. Koresh must have felt the same as I felt, I concluded aloud, striking my breast and babbling on. In his case, there's a lot of talk about him in the world, but he has no possibility to respond and offer his opinion. He must have become delusioned, I said. Disillusioned? Mr. cried, clapping his hands. That's true. Koresh was expecting the rapture. He thought he would go to heaven through the rapture, be transformed into an invincible Superman, and return to this world of disillusionment. Once back, he would take revenge on those who had disrupted his life, like record company directors, club managers, neighborhood men, government servants, and FBI agents. Superman? I asked, tilting my head. Did Koresh really want that? Sure, Mr. said confidently. Anyway, 1994 was when the eschatology of Europe ran out. The event in this case was the collective suicide committed in a temple by a group of people who believed the millennial kingdom would arrive after the end of the world. News of this act in Switzerland by the order of the Solar Temple was broadcast all over the world. In Japan, a more stable country, the eschatology ran out in 1995. Mr. was a thoughtful person. There were a lot of insects in the yard, and some of them crawled up to our knees as we were talking. Smiling broadly, Mr. caught them whenever they appeared and tossed them into the pond in the near corner of the yard. I'm raising carp. Mr. spoke as if a little embarrassed. 3 or 4 carp sprang from the water and snapped up the insects, even before they struck the surface. The carp's eyes started protruding recently from too little vitamin A, and there's no way to undo that except by feeding them insects. I looked. The eyes of some of the carp were as big as orange golf balls. The green pond glittered in the sunlight. Processed fish food is like Coca-Cola, Mr. said. Whatever eats it melts slowly away. Mr. returned to his topic. In Japan's case, there were crazy people who spread the poisonous gas sarin in a Tokyo subway station. 10 commuters died, and 5,000 were rushed by ambulance to the hospital. Om Shinrikyo, I exclaimed. That incident had been really exciting, but recalling the casualties, I gave a groan. Right, Om Shinrikyo. Its leader, Asahara, was training his believers as militia for Armageddon, the last war of mankind. His believers memorized the holy texts he recited, learned his breathing technique, kissed his toes, and wore headphones that made a constant, monotonous noise. Asahara would claim, "My home is the same planet UFOs come from." He also had a plan to build the world's biggest hospital with a cure-all bought from his home planet by ordering a UFO to bring it. On Judgment Day, Asahara was going to play the advocate between mankind and the aliens. Asahara was a blind man, Mr. continued in a sympathetic tone. As I discovered, he had a dream as a young man of going to Tokyo University, becoming a parliamentarian, and later Prime Minister of Japan. Of course, he did not even get close to a university and eventually came to admire Napoleon and Adolf Hitler. Actually, there's nothing strange about the fact that Japanese civil servants were targeted with the gas. I murmured sadly, I understand. Recently, I dropped by the publishing company I used to work for. The company still keeps the same old arrangement of 3 bosses and 1 employee. I told Mr. how I'd gone drinking that evening with the sole editor and asked how his work was going. It hadn't changed much from 4 years earlier when I worked there. The monthly salary was $500, and he proofread until 9 in the evening. When he proofread Hajar Goromnen, trifling, without any spaces, Boss A told him to correct it to Hajar-Kod-Obnen, while Boss B told him to correct it to Hajar God-Obnen. When he corrected it as told, Boss C then told him to correct it back to Hajar God-Obnen, as it was at the beginning. Nothing had changed. If there is a change, I said, chuckling, it's the change from Pojar God-Obnen to Hajar God-Obnen. I paused. The new employee said he admires Hitler and Pak Chung-hee. Damn it! I cried out in a voice combining the voices of an aspiring but frustrated rock star, a failed candidate for prime minister, and an exhausted editor working under 3 bosses. People are all the same. At some point in the course of life, one comes to admire Hitler and Park Chung-hee. At that moment, some children emerged, running from the living room, dashed across the yard, and leapt into the pool. They were so appetizing, like a set of Windshell's donuts filled with creamy strawberry jam. The pool was blue. A middle-aged woman holding vinyl swimming tubes in her arms came out of the living room, following the children, and tossed the tubes into the pool. She stood erect, was as slender as a baguette, and possessed skin that shone like just melted butter. She was, in short, mouth-wateringly fine, like a baguette spread with butter. Isn't it funny? Regardless of Koresh or Asahara, Mr. said, smiling, they all talk about aliens, UFOs, planets in outer space, and supermen. Anyway, with them, the end of the century came in 1996, before a new century started. Mr. turned his head and waved at the children in the pool. Did you finish your homework? He waved again. Yes, yes, yes. Mr. then smiled at the middle-aged woman. Honey, are you ready with the dinner? The woman smiled at him. Sure, the onions are very fresh. Mr. smiled broadly, revealing his gums. My wife and children, he explained. My wife and I are very proud of our children. The oldest is in the 6th grade. The second one is in the 4th grade, and the youngest one is in the 2nd grade. On the last test, the first one was 7th in the class. The second one was 5th, and the youngest one became class president. The oldest is pen pals with a Japanese middle school student. They write in English. And my child was translating a song titled Snail into English yesterday. The second one is talented in running and is being recruited by the school athletic club. Running is a good sport. One can compete without having to touch other people. The youngest is busy with online chatting and has been learning piano from an early age, and now is able to use a computer with nimble fingers. You must love your family, I said enviously. Of course, he replied, as if I should be envious. Having never had anything like a family, I was a little nonplussed. Mr. was blessed. He had a happy family. Say hello to the man, he spoke loudly but gently to the children in the pool. Hello, hello, hello. The children spoke loudly but gently in reply. Hello, I waved lightly toward them. Should we return to our topic? I said, pressing the record button of a small tape recorder. It was time for him to talk about himself. It was 6:30 in the morning, a few days after the commotion about the rapture in Korea, Mr. said. The kids were overturning the house, packing their school bags, and my wife was flipping out, screaming at the table. I went into the bathroom to escape all the racket. I stretched, then massaged my face, still swollen with alcohol from the night before. That morning, my grimace was hard to improve. I got ready to shave anyway, splashing some warm water on my chin and spreading the foam. Turning off the faucet of warm water, I was just about to put the razor blade to my chin. Mr. shook his head as if puzzled, then tilted it to one side. From somewhere came the sound of water boiling. It was strange. So I looked around. Mr. continued, relieved. And the toilet was boiling. Ah, I asked, curious. The toilet or the water in the toilet? The toilet itself, Mr. replied. I couldn't understand it either. I then looked up and now saw the sink boiling. I rubbed my eyes, opened them again, and saw the mirror boiling this time. I was greatly alarmed. He paused, then continued. As I was about to dash from the bathroom, shocked, I saw the bathroom door itself foaming like boiling water. I was utterly bewildered. Everything in the bathroom was boiling, and I felt myself suffocating as the world spun around and around. I grew dizzy and fainted. Mr. shuddered, as though merely recalling the experience were itself an unendurable pain. Things happened that way. That's amazing, I said, my mouth wide open. And that was only the beginning, right? Right, Mr. said. A year later, I woke up in the intensive care unit of a hospital. Mr. spoke with a face of misery and hopelessness. Later, I heard from a doctor that I had cut my wrist with a razor that morning and put my wrist in the sink. Mr. lowered his head. With my other hand, I managed to open a bottle of sleeping pills and swallow them all at once. Luckily, sleeping pills these days aren't strong enough to be fatal, and I needed only to have my stomach pumped. Unfortunately, my head struck the bathtub as I fell, and I had a concussion. So I had to undergo brain surgery. Saying this, he showed me the back of his head. A scar, as long as half a hand span, was visible through his hair. Along the length of the scar, some kind of bloody-colored moss was growing. What's this? I asked. Hidden flower. Unhwa, a type of moss. Mr. continued indifferently. I lay in a coma for a year. All this happened in that year while I was lying in the hospital. As Mr. lay comatose in the hospital, changes occurred in his body. In the injured back portion of his head, moss grew little by little, and the front part of his head was lush with spinach. From his armpits bloomed black rose, and from his gums sprang 4-leaf clovers. His fart smelt of mugwort, and from under his fingernails and toenails grew parsley, with stems firm and leaves of verdant green. Within the thighs grew small radishes, and tomatoes ripened on his calves. When he finally awoke after a long coma, he discovered himself a human greenhouse. He became a walking orchard and a chatty flower shop. Near the hospital room window, radiant with sunlight, Mr. photosynthesized. Though a secret, Mr. whispered, standing up after uncrossing his legs, my cock is a carrot. A large, red, stiff, strong one. That's amazing, I said. Simply amazing. I decided to believe all his damned lies. Eventually, finishing the interview, I stood up. Mr. invited me to dinner. While his wife was setting the table, I took some pictures of him. Mr. appeared in the photos a humble, polite, thoughtful, blessed man. In other words, a typically disgusting middle-class fellow who had once undergone psychiatric treatment to cope with his situation of having to photosynthesize, but was now finished with that sort of cure. Mr. was receiving enough sunlight and nutrition. His body was full of life energy. He was a man with God's blessing all to himself. Mr. told me that his only trouble was the cherry tree growing from his back, which caused some pain there due to its thickness. But he whispered, in a blissful tone of happiness, keeping it pruned is my wife's job. We prove our love for each other by means of these pruning shears. Toying at the salad on my plate with a fork, I went hungry. Mr. revealed to me that he was going to open a restaurant, specializing in raw vegetables, and call the place Pleasure Garden. My new nickname is Green Man. Actually, I'm a mutant human being, half animal, half plant, but the nickname's for convenience in addressing me. He suddenly took his hand from the plate. I sometimes find no meaning in life. Maybe this is just the way things are when we feel the end of our life approaching, or especially with the end of our life and the world. We then choose a different life. Mr. raised his fork high. A new life, a level up. I've reached old age now after passing through middle age, but I'm still looking for the meaning of life. something beyond the level of daily existence, even if it were just the life of Green Man. With all this, Mister's name was recorded in the Believe It or Not Knowledge's Museum of Cartoon History. We can see him in that museum. He's there along with all the other cartoon characters who lived above the level of daily existence. Superman, who was half human and half alien. Spider-Man, who was half human and half arachnid. Batman, who wore a mask and flew through the bleak night sky over Gotham City. And our Green Man, who's relaxing in a lawn chair and photosynthesizing, his body full of hanging vegetables and fruits. Close to tears, Mister confessed that he and his family are enjoying life better than any time before. Mister, in fact, leaped from his own life at the end of his century toward the dimension of the previous century. Going beyond the limit of one's own existence is a thing to be envied, especially for someone like me, who has wasted every moment of his youth walking along the pathway of despair. Although the dimension of the century before was confined within a frame of aluminum hanging in a corner on a shabby wall in a museum of cartoon history, this caption was added below: Superhuman Green Man. Green Green Grass of Home is a short story by Baek Minsuk, published in his collection 16 Stories of Believe It or Not Knowledge, published by Moonji Publishing Company. The English version is translated by Sun A. Huang and narrated for this audiobook by Thomas Craig. This audiobook was produced in 2021 with the support of the Literature Translation Institute of Korea.